Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Our webinar is going to begin. I'm Steve Love, President, CEO of the Dallas-Fort Worth Hospital Council. We thank you again for being here today for this educational webinar hosted in coordination with Alexion Pharmaceuticals, Inc., who is an associate member of the Hospital Council. Today's topic, continuing to improve healthcare by moving beyond the pill with pharma. Alexion is a global biopharmaceutical company focused on discovery, development, and commercialization of medicines for severe and life-threatening rare disorders. The company was established in 1992 and is headquartered in Boston. Today's session is going to explore partnership opportunities with pharma to improve healthcare delivery system and patient outcomes. In today's environment, we all must continue to evolve as healthcare stakeholders and have roles where we partner in improving quality healthcare while moving beyond the pill. Today, our speaker is Keith A. Szymanski, a Regional Clinical Account Director at AstraZeneca U.S. Medical. Keith has worked as a pharmacist in pharmaceutical research for more than 20 years. He also has served previously, is also currently serving as a research lead with Takeda Pharmaceuticals and is a consultant with Eli Lilly and Company. We look forward to his presentation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm going to turn it over to Keith. Welcome, Keith, and we look forward to hearing your remarks.
Great. Thank you very much, Steve. I really do appreciate it. And one of the things that I just want to clarify is, so I'm currently employed by AstraZeneca as a clinical account director. And just a little bit more about my background. So I was in clinical practice. Then I was involved with the P&T committee. Then I ended up getting involved in the pharmaceutical industry. And to be quite honest, one of the reasons why I got involved in the pharmaceutical industry is that, so when I was on a P&T committee, I would get information from pharmaceutical manufacturers, and I would kind of scratch my head and say, I don't know for sure if this is answering all the questions that I have about the utilization of this particular medication and like. And so that's the reason why I decided to go ahead and move into the pharmaceutical industry to really kind of dive deeper into, what type of information is being generated by this type of company, and then also to really be thinking beyond about how is this information being utilized, not only by clinicians, but then also payers, and then ultimately by patients as well. And so the reason why I give a little more context around my background is because the perspective that I'm bringing from a pharmaceutical company is really more from the medical affairs side. And so really with that background of being a clinician, being on a P&T committee, and then also being a researcher as well, that's kind of the perspective that I'm going to be sharing with you. And I think one of the things that probably needs to be addressed first is the phrase that I included in the title of this presentation. And so it's continue to improve healthcare quality by moving beyond the pill with pharma. And the question becomes, so really, what is this idea about moving beyond the pill? And so what I'm going to go ahead and do is go ahead and describe it. And then hopefully you'll get a better sense as I kind of start walking through more of the context behind this movement, and then also where are some opportunities that we could be moving beyond the pill. And so when I talk about moving beyond the pill, it's really trying to move beyond this idea of a pharmaceutical company just bringing medication to market and really evolving more into being a trusted partner in working with clinicians, researchers, and payers to help ensure that the right patients are getting the right medication at the right time. And I think sometimes that almost sounds somewhat cliche, the right patient, right medication, right time. But, as I start going through these examples here, is that I think you're going to see that there really is this need for continued partnership because we do quite a bit of research. We generate quite a bit of information. And I think that, once again, it's really trying to tailor it towards addressing problems that are out there and hopefully developing solutions. So with that being said, the overall outline of my presentation is I try to keep the slides somewhat to a minimum because hopefully there'll be some provocative comments that are made to stimulate some good questions. So we'll have a good time to really address those questions and have hopefully a robust discussion around this particular topic. And the general outline that I have is I'm just going to talk just briefly around AstraZeneca, and it's really more or less to kind of provide you with a background. So it's not so much as an advertisement for AstraZeneca per se. It's really more about just understanding the perspective that I have with this company. And then it really moves into this idea of, so why are we even talking about trying to move beyond the pill? Giving some opportunities to move beyond the pill, more around examples, and then finally a quick summary. So with that being said, with AstraZeneca, we're really focused in on, I'd say, 4 therapeutic areas. And so it's oncology, cardiovascular, renal, and metabolism, respiratory and immunology, and other. And with partnering with Alexion, is that the rare diseases have entered into our portfolio. So you can see that we have these core therapeutic areas that we're focused in on, and this is basically our portfolio. Now I will tell you, in the upper left quadrant is where the cardiovascular and renal metabolism products are. We move over into the right, that's respiratory and immunology. In the lower left quadrant, that's in our oncology space. And it's not so much to be going through all these products. And actually, kind of one of the things I find interesting is that in my particular role, what I do is that I get involved with different types of accounts, and they may have questions on our particular products, and I can go ahead and address those questions. And one of the requests that comes in says, okay, is basically, okay, I need a pipeline presentation, and by the way, you have like 30 minutes to do that. And I often kind of laugh at times, because when I start looking at our pipeline, and I also look at our portfolio, it's like it can be actually quite challenging to kind of do that type of presentation within 15 to 30 minutes. Now, the reason why I put this slide in is just to let you know is that we really have a committed interest to these therapeutic areas. And because we have a committed interest in this, you can see that we're developing initiatives in these areas to, once again, kind of move beyond that pill and trying to really understand if the appropriate patients are getting our medications at the right time and the like. So to ask the first question is, so why this whole idea, why moving beyond the pill? Why not just stop at just getting a drug to market and thinking about partnership opportunities? And so I'll give a couple of examples here. I think one of the biggest things is that healthcare has become a lot more complex. And as you think about it more and more from the patient's perspective, is that you can see how this complexity continues to build. So in this particular slide here, it's around the burden of COPD exacerbations. And if you start on the far left-hand slide, you can see that there really are a significant number of patients who do experience COPD exacerbations. Now, the key to really treating COPD is really trying to prevent that first exacerbation. But if you notice, and I'm not going to go through all the data with this, but in that second column, exacerbations are often under-recognized, under-reported, and undertreated. So you could actually have patients be suffering, and meanwhile, they could have this underlying inflammation occurring and leading to more progression of their disease. And that in and of itself is a major problem, where this is not being recognized for appropriate therapy or for medical attention. And so that in and of itself kind of speaks to why there's a need to kind of be moving on the pill here, is really to kind of dive into these areas where there may be some opportunities for improvement. And then on the far right-hand side is that what becomes even more problematic is that if they have one exacerbation, it increases their risk of actually having more exacerbations, and this leads to possibly causing more irreversible damage, disease progression, and early death. So it's just kind of this theme of trying to get involved early and to identify problems early, so hopefully you can negate or you can avoid some of the negative sequelae that can happen over time. And this can kind of continues, and just as adding to the complexity of these patients. So with COPD patients, they often have comorbid conditions. And so in this particular graph here, what I'm showing is the odds of having greater than 2 exacerbations per year. And you can see how it increases if you have lung cancer or heart failure or asthma. And the reason why I focus in on those 3 is because we have interests, we have therapeutic interests in those. And so once again, it's not only about really trying to appropriately diagnose patients and bring those right patients actually to get medical attention, but then also recognize the complexity of these other comorbid illnesses that can also be playing a role as well. And I'm going to kind of continue with this because diabetes, we have an interest in diabetes as well, and it can increase the risk of heart failure, cardiovascular disease, and also renal dysfunction. Heart failure often occurs up to 50% of patients with type 2 diabetes are at risk for developing heart failure. Heart failure is underdiagnosed. So once again, kind of going in that vein of what I mentioned with regards to COPD, is that if it's being underdiagnosed, is that these patients may not be seeking appropriate care early on enough until maybe got into more advanced stages of the disease. And then also thinking about the economic consequences as well with regards to having type 2 diabetes, increasing the hospitalizations for heart failure. And then also in the bottom right corner is renal dysfunction is also an unmet need in type 2 diabetes. So thinking about chronic kidney disease as well. So once again, it's really adding to this complexity of these patients with these overlapping comorbid illnesses that really, I think, speaks to this idea of, look, is there additional help that can be garnered? And, as a pharmaceutical company, is that we're doing research in these areas and, also market research as well to really be trying to understand insights. And so once again, it beckons this idea of really trying to move beyond just providing a medication and thinking about how can this medication actually be utilized with patients and also with clinicians in an appropriate manner to, once again, to be improving patient outcomes. And this continues with regards to hyperkalemia or high potassium levels, where you can see these patients also have comorbid conditions. And it seems to be kind of the same culprits over and over again. If I go on to the far right-hand side of the screen here, is that roughly 45% of patients with hyperkalemia or high potassium levels also have chronic kidney disease. 20% patients with hyperkalemia also have heart failure. 51% of patients with hyperkalemia have diabetes mellitus. And so once again, you can see kind of just adding to this complexity and just once again, providing additional insights to be trying to improve care of these patients with these complex patients with these different comorbid illnesses. So that kind of sets the stage of, so really why move beyond just developing a medication and introducing it to the marketplace? Because there are some gaps in care and patients are becoming more complex. And so what I want to move into now is really this idea of, well, what could be some examples where you kind of moved into this space of trying to improve the quality of care? And hence the reason why this particular section is entitled Opportunities to Move Beyond the Pill. Now, I will tell you is that I was told in advance that there are a lot of hospital individuals on this particular call. And so there's a couple of hospital examples. I would say that I've also mixed into some outpatient examples as well with regards to screening and getting involved earlier. But it's giving some examples of where AstraZeneca has really, I think, stepped up to the plate to be exploring more options and opportunities to be improving patient outcomes. And so starting in with asthma. So asthma is common and often uncontrolled. And on the far left-hand side of the screen, and now this is somewhat dated because the data is up to 2019, but it's basically showing the asthma prevalence in the US. And so up to 2019, you're at 7.8%. Now on the far right-hand side, what becomes really problematic is that 50% of children and greater than 60% of adults with asthma have uncontrolled disease. And so one of the questions becomes, well, what can actually be done with regards to trying to help control disease? And what I will say too is that as I go through these examples, I'll be the first to admit, I don't have a magic bullet that's going to address all the issues here, but at least it's going to be providing some opportunities for a start to engage in discussions and a starting point where, be coming up with some potential solutions that might be able to help. So with regards to some of the work that we've done at AstraZeneca, it's actually moved into developing an asthma impairment and risk questionnaire. And basically, if I start on the left-hand side of this particular screen, you can see that this particular questionnaire can actually be utilized by patients in a print format. It can actually be included into an electronic health or EMR, and then also it could actually be provided as a link to patients, so they can actually fill out on if they have an iPhone or a laptop computer. And basically what it's doing is really trying to assess their symptoms, because I think so often you only have those multiple touch points with a provider, and where the care is really taking place is with the patients in that outpatient setting. And so with this type of a questionnaire, it's really moving towards making sure that patients are staying engaged. And the questions cover asthma medications, respiratory symptoms, and utilization of healthcare resources. I know that in the middle of the screen is the actual questionnaire, and it's very difficult to see. And on the far right-hand side is basically noting it is validated, and you have a scoring system where you can basically share this type of information with the clinician so that the patient is engaged and also the provider is engaged as well, with once again really trying to address what are the asthma symptoms and trying to get them under control. If I move into another example, it's with regards to lung cancer. And on this particular slide, what it's basically showing is at the stage of diagnosis, you can see that roughly 56% of patients are diagnosed where you have distant disease. And I can just tell you up front is that when you're starting to being diagnosed with distant disease or basically where it's already metastasized, is that when you start thinking about your 5-year relative survival, so if I move over to the far right-hand side, is that if you look at that distant disease, you're at 6.3%. Now, if you kind of compare and contrast, if I go back over to the stage of diagnosis where it's localized at 18% in the pie graph, and then I go back over to now, if you're diagnosing earlier and possibly getting treatment earlier, you look at that 5-year relative survival, now you're closer to 60%. So it's that idea about trying to intervene earlier and really trying to bring those appropriate patients, into the into healthcare so they get the appropriate type of treatment. And so recognizing that's a problem, AstraZeneca has actually helped form the Lung Ambition Alliance, where this particular alliance really is focused in on eliminating lung cancer as a cause of death. And that's really a pretty bold ambition. And the priorities that are really, actually one of the major priorities of this particular alliance is to improve lung cancer screening rates. And there are a lot of different types of barriers, a lot of perceptions with regards to lung cancer screening. But if you go back, if I were to go back to that previous slide, you can see here is that if you can get patients earlier, screen them earlier, and really diagnose lung cancer earlier, you're improving their overall survival. And this particular alliance is set up with AstraZeneca, Guardant, which is providing blood tests for various cancers, and then also the International Association for the Study of Lung Cancer, as well as the Global Lung Cancer Coalition. And also, if there's a general interest in learning more about this type of Lung Ambition project, there is contact information, and I did include the website in the far left-hand corner. But once again, this is really more of an example of AstraZeneca kind of moving beyond that pill and thinking about, okay, so what about appropriate screening so that the patients are getting appropriate therapy? If I continue on, another example is with chronic kidney disease. So it's common and it's a progressive disease with a low diagnosis rate, and approximately 1 in 7 adults are estimated to have CKD in the United States. So you can see that it is fairly common. I think one of the things that becomes more troubling is on the far right-hand side, is that early CKD can be asymptomatic, and up to 90% of adults with CKD in the US are unaware that they have it. So I know that when I was in clinical practice, I do more volunteer work now, is that, the way that, I would work with patients is that, if I was reviewing medications with them, is that I would basically kind of focus in on, what was their chief complaint, review their medications, and I wasn't kind of thinking beyond the box. I mean, I don't think that I was assessing and looking to say, well, does this patient have, chronic kidney disease, early stage development? Is there anything that I could be doing early on here? But I think it's this whole idea of trying to increase that awareness. Because if I move on to the next slide, and I know this is a fairly simplistic diagram of chronic kidney disease, but the take-home point is that early intervention in CKD slows disease progression and preserves kidney function, improves patient outcomes. So on this graph, you're looking basically at eGFRs, or estimated glomerular filtration rate, which is basically a measure of kidney function. And you can see here that it's basically looking over time. And if you look at the deep blue graph, you can see that if you don't intervene at all, is that over a much steeper slope. So basically leads to sooner deterioration into kidney failure. Is that if you have more of a late intervention, which is kind of that aqua blue line, you can see that you start to kind of bend the curve a little bit, where basically you're not getting to kidney failure until a little bit later, but that if you can intervene earlier, that really you can actually adjust and get on like a new slope where actually you're really trying to avoid kidney failure for a longer period of time. Now, like I said, a very simplistic schematic with this, and right now AstraZeneca has an interest in really looking to think about, okay, is it about increasing awareness with providers? Is it developing different types of tools or applications that could be helping providers with regards to treating patients? Because so often this is being overlooked. And so once again, it's this idea of kind of moving beyond just the medication and thinking about okay, how can appropriate patients be diagnosed and receive appropriate care? Now, I put in another example here and it's kind of interesting with regards to innovative value strategies, and that's the term that we use at AstraZeneca, other places, value-based agreements and the like. And so basically, what you're doing with these types of arrangements is that the pharmaceutical company is saying, if you're looking at, let's say, hemoglobin A1C levels, if you hit a particular hemoglobin A1C level, and we've agreed to that's going to be the threshold. If it's higher than the threshold, then there may be some type of financial arrangement, maybe a rebate associated with it. If you're lower than that, maybe there's not going to be additional rebate that's being paid. So it's really trying to pay more for outcomes. But what I would say, I really enjoyed this. I had the opportunity to not only develop innovative value strategies, but to implement them with regional systems as also with national payers as well, is that it really is a process. And one of the things that I came to realize more and more is that if I kind of start on the bottom part of this screen and I kind of work my way up, so kind of go through the journey, if you will, is that it just doesn't start with regards to, hey, we're just going to come up with this innovative value strategy and just send it over to a particular customer. But it's really sitting down with that customer very early on and asking those questions of, what are your needs? What are your priorities? Are there certain types of gaps that we should be looking into? And then developing that particular type of plan. Because I can tell you early on is that if you don't have that type of alignment, is that it can lead to a complete utter disaster. And so it really turns into this collaborative type of process and really a working partnership. The other thing that becomes extremely important is the alignment on the construct and defining the win-win-win. And what we mean by this triple win is that really it's going to be a win for patients, it could be a win for the customer, and then it could be a win for AstraZeneca, especially if you're going to be trying to improve patient outcomes, is that there can be the kind of like this try-win, if you will. But what I think becomes important is this idea about the alignment on the construct very early on, and also the transparency and building trust so that when results are coming in, is that it's not like a surprise, right? It's like you've put the due diligence in to come up with a construct, and so kind of what information is going to be collected, and also knowing too if there could be some shortfalls early on. And then the other part of it, continuing on with this journey, is also the implementation and the monitoring. And so you're identifying learnings to apply to the next iteration of the innovative value strategy if one were to exist. Now, I can tell you is that when I talk with various customers in implementing these types of strategies, or when I did in the past in my previous role, is that so much of the focus was on just, well, it's about the rebate. Do you get a rebate or don't you get a rebate? And one of the things that I would try to impress upon the customers, and I'm going to move into the next slide here, is that when you are doing this type of a construct, you're actually generating information. Because when you come up with an IVS or a value-based agreement, you're selecting, let's say, a cohort of patients to follow. And in that cohort, you have eligibility criteria. So you can basically see, which types of patients you're including in your final cohort. And sometimes you're going to find that, you can uncover opportunities for quality improvement. Is there an opportunity to be improving persistence? Are there certain individuals that weren't included in your particular cohort that should have been included? And it kind of comes back to this idea of it's not just about, the rebate. It's actually generating information that can be utilized with the external customer to kind of evaluate some of the care that they're providing. And so when you start to generate this type of evidence, what really becomes important, and I'll tell you, is as I go through this presentation, and I'm kind of old school with this, is that one of the keys to success is this idea about developing trust. And you know what? And some people, I can't see people's eyes. You may roll your eyes and just say, "Okay, Keith, really developing trust here." But I can tell you, out of the numerous engagements that I've had, is that where I can increase trust and also be very transparent, that really led to successful outcomes. And so it's really not only establishing trust with regards to people that you're working with, but then also with regards to the analysis that's being done as well, and also the data source, so that everyone is really aligned to it. The other thing that becomes important with regards to these types of projects is the timely collection of data. And so, I know with regards to some of the initial concepts we had developed, you're looking maybe 2 to 3 years out, and customers are scratching their heads saying, "Hey, wait a minute, I'm going to get results. I'm going to sign this agreement. I'm going to get results 2 to 3 years out. Doesn't make a lot of sense to me. I'd like to see results in 6 months or to a year." So once again, it's this idea about making sure that you're actually creating something that's in a timely manner, so that actually the results can be utilized. And then the final component in this particular area is something that is really sustainable, meaning that you can actually implement it. Now, because there've been numerous times where we've had discussions and we start talking about a particular outcome, and I will tell you in general, like with regards to overall survival, is that you may think this is for those of you that have been involved in research, you kind of know where I'm going with this. Is that really to determine overall survival, it can actually be quite challenging. And what type of data source are you going to utilize? And so you don't see a lot of these value-based agreements or innovative value strategies that are using overall survival, because trying to capture that data is problematic. So once again, it kind of comes back to this idea of these innovative value strategies are another way of trying to move beyond just a medication and thinking about what's the information that's being generated in this type of an agreement that could actually be improving patient care, and could actually have a particular customer, whether it be a hospital system, whether a payer, to take a look at their data from another perspective and say, what, there may be some opportunities for improvement. The other thing that I want to bring up as well is with regards to pharma serving as more of a consultant and sharing best practices. This is an example with regards to Andexxa, which is basically a medication used for treating those patients who have received apixaban or rivaroxaban and actually have a life-threatening or uncontrolled bleed. And so, the previous examples that I went through, it was this idea about like trying to do a project to actually trying to improve patient care. But as I was talking a little bit earlier, I was saying that, we do our own insights. We talk with a lot of different healthcare providers, a lot of different hospital systems, and we're collecting a lot of information. And is there an opportunity to be sharing this type of information with additional customers who may be trying to develop a certain type of protocol? And so, I'm going to focus in on just some of the bullet points on the right-hand side. And it's this idea about moving beyond the pill to ensure that there's appropriate utilization of a medication. So best practices for the use of this particular product: establishing an institutional protocol, creating a multidisciplinary team to guide the implementation process, require prescribers to undergo Andexxa education before prescribing, entering Andexxa into the electronic ordering system, and then also implementing a monitoring process to periodically review utilization of Andexxa and develop routine use guidelines. And so I won't continue to go through all the other bullet points here, but once again, it kind of moves pharma into this area of providing suggestions or recommendations for appropriate utilization of a particular medication. And so once again, it kind of moves beyond that idea of just, here's a medication, and more about, can we share some best practices to really share with clinicians, to share with different providers, to share with payers. So once again, you can really optimize your patient outcomes. So where have we been? Basically talked a little bit more about how to, kind of moving beyond the pill with pharma. And then I gave some more examples with regards to, so what do we mean by moving beyond the pill? And if I were to go ahead and kind of summarize, is that, so why move beyond the pill at all? And I think it's because, healthcare is continuing to become more complex. And I think it really behooves us, people in pharma, clinicians, payers, and the like, is to be really understanding the complexity of it, and really more so from a patient's perspective. And I think that the more that we start focusing in on the patient's perspective and trying to do, what's best for the patient, it moves us into this area of really trying to deal with more of the complexity of the comorbid illnesses with regards to underdiagnosis of certain types of conditions, to really try to ensure that patients are getting the appropriate care. And then as far as with regards to opportunities to move beyond the pill, I provided, different types of examples with regards to with pharma, and that is thinking about, are there better ways to go about monitoring certain patients so that their symptoms can be shared with providers in a more timely manner? Is there an opportunity to go ahead and diagnose patients earlier, and in particular with regards to screening and oncology, or even with regards to CKD? So once again, is that so you're not waiting too long where you could be leading to more adverse outcomes versus if you would have intervened earlier. And then the other part of it too is that, and I use the example with Indexa, is that this idea of can you share best practices? Once again, to really be more of a partner in trying to share thoughts, insights, so that you really can have appropriate utilization of a particular medication. And that's all fine. And the last bullet point that that I put in here, and I think this really becomes extremely important, is that if you're really starting to move in that direction, trying to think about moving beyond the pill, and I kind of look at myself as being kind of old school with it, is that from a health system standpoint, or if you're in a hospital and you're thinking about, is there an opportunity to partner with pharma, is that I really mean this. It's about really looking at the values of the company and making sure that your values are aligned. I can tell you from my perspective is that, having worked as a clinician and then also having worked now currently working in pharma, is that there are some times that you're going to work with, you may be investigating or exploring an opportunity with a particular partner, but the values aren't aligned. And it can really be one heck of a long process or a long project. And that's why, as far as, trying to think about what are we trying to accomplish, and probably more importantly, how are we looking to accomplish? Within AstraZeneca, we have basically 5 values that we really try to implement and utilize with our decision making. And the first one is trying to put patients first. And so that when you're trying to make a decision, you're thinking, is this the best for the patient? But then also following the science. I mean, we're developing medications, but then also thinking about, the good science part of it, and then trying to really do the right thing, being entrepreneurial, and then finally also playing to win. And that playing to win is really more along the lines of like really trying to go the extra mile. And thinking about how you can go about improving patient care. The other part of it is with regards to transparency. I can tell you that with a lot of different projects, and I've been fortunate to work in a lot of different these areas in different types of collaborations, different projects with health systems and payers and the like, and it's really making sure that there is this complete and utter transparency of what we're trying to accomplish, so there really isn't any type of hidden agendas. And then finally, and I mentioned this previously, but to me it's worth repeating, because sometimes when I mention this to people, they just kind of gloss over, saying, Keith, no, more importantly, you got to give us, you got to give me a process guide. This is what we need to do first. But there's so much to be said about really establishing this trust and making sure that you have this level of confidence in the person that you're partnering with or the company that you're partnering with, that you're really trying to do things for the right reasons. And so that's the overall summary. That concludes my presentation. I really tried to leave quite a bit of time for discussion, and because I think, for some of you, you may have been involved in some of these initiatives or projects with Pharma, but I'd really like to hear your perspectives. And like I said, I would love to address any questions that you may have. And so if we could please open the lines up for questions, or if there are questions that have been submitted, I'd be more than happy to address them.
Thank you so much for a great presentation. You really gave a lot of good information. Here's a question that's come in about how do you view and define keys to success when you're moving beyond the pill with pharma?
Yeah, so well, it's actually a good thing that I'm staying on this particular slide here, because what I would say is that if I go to the bottom of the slide, starting to move beyond the pill, is that I think that these 3 bullet points that I made is that, to me, the success really depends upon, have you really aligned with your values to embark on a particular type of project? Is this a certain level of transparency where you really, you understand what the agenda is, what you're trying to accomplish, and you don't feel like there's hidden agendas? Or, I'll tell you the other part of it too is with regards to when you're developing analytic plans, of bringing, the right type of analytics or research to the table, so that there's no sense of like, well, hey, wait a minute here, is someone trying to pull a fast one with regards to how you're constructing the analysis? And also this idea of trust. is that, you know, can we be working together in this open and transparent fashion where, you know what, I may have to rely upon, let's say, a clinician for, you know, this part of the project. They may have to rely upon me on the pharma side for another part of the project. And then the other thing that I want to mention as well is with regards to just thinking about the keys for success is that being intentional with your desired outcome. Because I can tell you is that sometimes people get involved with regards to some of these checkbox activities, like, you know, I need to do this type of a project to meet a certain type of quota and the like. And to me, those always kind of seem to falter. And it's really trying to think about, at the end of the day, are you really driving towards the patient? Are you aligned on what type of an outcome you're trying to expect, or what type of a change you're looking to enact? Because I can tell you on the pharmaceutical side, we do a tremendous job of generating information. I mean, and when I mean a tremendous job, we come out with a heck of a lot of information, right? And I'm really trying to kind of challenge myself, and even with the department that I'm in, is this idea of, yeah, but what are we doing with this information? I mean, is this information getting into a point where, you know, it's trying to impact patient care, or is it basically like you just do a presentation and you walk away after that particular presentation? And so this kind of comes back into kind of that fourth key, and that idea of really thinking about what's really that desired outcome with the project or the type of partnership that you're looking to develop. So I would say those were kind of I would say about 4 keys of success. The three of the keys are here on this particular slide.
Great. Good summary. You know, I know you touched on this in your presentation. Well, what do you think are the different roles that pharma can play in partnering with healthcare systems?
Yeah. So I think there's a couple different roles. The first one is being a collaborator in development. Now I'll go back to the example that I had with regards to the AirQ questionnaire. And so this is where AstraZeneca played a role in working with clinicians to help validate this particular instrument. And so you're really actually serving as a collaborator in development of an actual product that can be used to help improve patient outcomes. I think there's also a role for being more of a consultant. And I think this kind of comes through in the Andexa example that I utilized, where it's the sharing of best practices. Because we do it, like even with myself, I have a particular territory and I talk with a lot of different health systems. I talk with a lot of different payers as well, and I get a lot of different types of perspectives. And then I can kind of go back to the introduction is that, like I said, it always kind of scares me when I think about that I've been kind of you know, in practice, whether with pharmaceutical companies or in clinical practice for over 20 years. I mean, that I don't know if any of you have reached that kind of point. When you start talking about those types of numbers, obviously it's kind of scary, but this idea of like those experiences that you have is that, like I said, trying to be more of a consultant on a particular project. And then the other thing, and I'll tell you, I've picked up on this more and more, is this idea about information overload. And I'll tell you, I see, I have to go back to a couple conversations that I had with chief medical officers, and it makes a heck of a lot of sense to me. Because if you think about all the information that's coming out, and I'll focus in on medications, especially in the oncology space, I mean, it seems like every other day there's new studies that are coming out, and trying to stay on top of it, is that the information flow is becoming so much, and that, you know, when I was getting some feedback from chief medical officers, what they were saying was that what they really appreciated was, you know, someone like in my position being more of an information manager, in the sense that fair and balanced information of paramount importance, but it's not about going through all these different details and basically, you know, going back and kind of pulling out the fire hose and kind of blowing people away with all the information. It's really trying to distill it. And I think the thing that really resonated with me quite a bit and I've heard this from a couple different chief medical officers, they were saying it's like, you know, presenting information to me in a way that I can actually take some of those points and share them directly with a patient, as opposed to basically just sharing all these different details, and they're scratching their heads just saying, you know, it's an information overload. So if I kind of go back to that original question, is that I think that, you know, kind of a couple of roles that kind of come to the top of my head is kind of collaborator in developing, so being an active collaborator, a consultant, and sharing, you know, kind of based upon experience, what may be some best practices or different types of experiences that may actually help out someone working in a hospital setting or within a health system. And then also this idea around this being kind of an information manager. And what I want to be crystal clear about it, I'm not saying that you being a cherry picker or filtering out important information. What I'm saying is really trying to get down to what information is real critical for a clinician, for a payer, or for a patient to know.
Thank you. That was pretty interesting response there, and the different roles you can play. As you mentioned, you've got experience with this. You've worked to look to how to move beyond the pill. In your experience, what are some barriers that you've faced?
So in really, trying to move towards being more of a trusted partner, right? In trying to ensure that patients get, the appropriate medications, and the like, is that, I'll be honest with you. I think that there's times I get involved in situations where some of the partners that I'm working with, they may have assumptions that are not verbalized, and they may have certain perceptions of pharma. And so, you start talking about a particular type of project, is that, my request would be, if you have a problem, or if you're skeptical, or if you have a concern, let's get out on the table and let's talk about it. Because sometimes when you don't verbalize those types of assumptions, maybe they're right, maybe they're wrong, is that they continue to fester. And sometimes they lead to premature discontinuation of a particular project, or not to even embark on a particular type of project. So that's one type of a barrier, is that and it probably goes back to, if you haven't established that certain level of trust, is that some of these assumptions just may not come to the surface, but yet behind the scenes is that they could either make or break the project. Another one is with regards to concerns with sharing data. I think that's one of the ongoing issues, and I can completely understand that, especially when you start talking about, let's say, if you're doing some type of collaborative outcomes research type of project, where it's of paramount importance for patient privacy, to have de-identified data and the like. But I can tell you, there's a lot of institutions that I work with, they're just very reluctant to be even sharing de-identified data and the like. So that can sometimes serve as a barrier. And then the other thing too, and this is kind of one of those softer ones, but I've appreciated this more and more, is that embarking on projects that can create too much disruption. I will tell you is that, and I kind of laugh about this myself, is that, I think all of us kind of get pulled in so many different directions, and especially for those of you that are in clinical practice, seeing patients, you may have other responsibilities as well, is that where I kind of laugh sometimes is like, I feel as though sometimes someone could be saying, hey, Keith, I want to share something with you that could save your life. And I'm too busy trying to do other things. I'm like, I don't have time for it right now. And so I think that's another thing as well, is that when you're starting to think about really moving beyond the pill, or thinking about a particular type of project, is that if you're going to be moving into a situation where you be causing a lot of disruption or a lot of additional burden, let's say on a clinician, for them to, let's say, increasing number of clicks to get to information, you're almost, that really serves as a major barrier. And so it really kind of comes back to this idea of making sure that whatever you're going to be embarking on is really simple. And I can't stress this enough about this ease of implementation and not trying to disrupt too much, because if I can just say, I sense this more and more, that people are being pulled in so many different directions that slight disruptions can just stop a project in its tracks.
You bring up some good points, and as you were going through some of those barriers, I certainly understand that de-identified data, and even with de-identified data, some institutions are reluctant, as you said, and also the disruption that projects can cause. But when you face those and you've dealt with them, have you been able to overcome some of those barriers you mentioned? Maybe not all, but at least some.
Yeah. So I would say that with the kind of the three barriers that I mentioned, or I would say the three primary barriers, they're probably the most common barriers, that I've seen. Definitely not a comprehensive list. I'll kind of go through with regards to kind of gauge my success. Now, a lot of the success is dependent upon the project, but if I think about with regards to assumptions not being verbalized, I would say, to a certain extent, because one of the things, that I try to do is that I try to, if I'm getting a sense that there's a reluctance or that there's some type of concern, is that to try to address that in a meeting or try to bring that to the surface so it just doesn't continue to fester. And so, and I would say that I've had pretty good success with that. But then again, too, I mean, you can't force people to talk. But I would say that, you know, with that one, efforts can be made to kind of, like I said, really address those bigger issues. With regards to sharing data, I'll tell you that one's highly variable. And I can tell you is that there are some systems, you know, they interact with where they're very much set on no, you know, this is our policy and we're not going to deviate from that. And then there's other institutions that, like I said, are a little more flexible with it. And so with that one, that's kind of been middle of the road. And I wouldn't say, you know, that's been a complete success because really that's highly dependent upon really the policies that have been set forth in leadership with the different, whether it be plans, systems, hospitals, you know, that interact with. And then the other thing is that with regards to projects to create too much disruption is that this is something that I've actually become a lot more sensitive to. But I will tell you is that, you know, I talk with my colleagues is that we probably need to pay more attention to this because, you know, in talking with some other, you know, with other researchers, what, you know, one of the things that they've mentioned is like, you know, if you're asking any clinician or, you know, a provider to be taking active steps, it's too much. Their days are already too busy. And so you have to move more towards like, you know, if there's a pop-up screen that can occur. And I know for some of you may say, you know what, the last thing you need is another pop-up screen, you know, like if you're trying to create awareness. But it's this idea of really trying to think more about how can you come up with different types of options that it's easier for clinicians to incorporate that into their decision making, you know, where appropriate. And I would say that there's been some successes with that, but there probably needs to be some more time and attention devoted to that because that is really what I'm finding. You know, in the past, you could do things that are a little more disruptive, but there's this interesting phenomenon ongoing, and I'm not sure if it's due to the pandemic, it's played a role in it or not. But this idea of just people having less and less time. And so, and that's an ongoing challenge with regards to trying to do something new and trying to incorporate results into practice or into a policy.
You know, you've talked a lot about moving beyond the pill with pharma. In your mind, Keith, what does success really look like when that's been achieved?
Yeah, so, you know, I'll tell you, you know what, this has kind of morphed with me. I mean, you know what, morphed probably isn't the best word. It evolved. Because I would say early on is that when I was involved more in active research, you know, to me, the goal was, hey, you know, I can do this research project, I get it published. And then over time, and I want to kind of go back to kind of like one of the themes of this particular presentation was that that's not good enough. And what I mean by that is just generating information for me, and I'm trying to challenge myself more and more with it. It's just not good enough. And it's really trying to take that information and maybe distill it in a way, present it in a way, put it in a format that you can drive towards trying to improve patient outcomes, or it can lead to a difference in patient outcomes. And I'm going to give a quick example of this, is that, you know, probably one of the best experiences I had, and it was working on a particular research project, and we were looking at, there were some warnings that came out with a particular therapeutic class of medications. And now, as it turned out, is that all of the medications within a particular class didn't have the same warnings, didn't have the same type of adverse outcomes. But yet, we basically looked at patients were on this class of medications. The safety warnings came out, got into major journals, and then we looked to see, okay, what happened with regards to treatment patterns? And what was really concerning to me was that there was a lot of patients, and this was actually in type 2 diabetes, where there was a large percentage of patients who decided to stop therapy altogether, whether they were not on the medication that was associated with a particular type of adverse event. They stopped therapy. And so we had this information, and we were able to actually go out and talk with clinicians, talk with payers to say, hey, look, you may want to be aware of this. That could lead to some more patient engagement, and to at least have that conversation, as opposed to just letting patients that were falling through the cracks. And so we really had, and one thing that I took a lot of, I was really proud of, was that to me, that was information that was really being driven towards patient care, that was trying to ensure that patients were getting appropriate therapy. maybe it was the right move for some patients to be off their therapy, but for those patients who just had an emotional reaction and just decided to stop therapy that was appropriate for them, at least we increase awareness. So this idea of, I kind of have this phrase that I go over and over again of like really trying to drive towards the patient about as we're getting information or as we're embarking on projects, how can we actually get this to where it's impacting patient care versus it just stops at, hey, we got a publication in a journal or we got a nice write-up, you did a particular poster presentation. And once again, you're trying to really get back to how you're impacting patient care. And to me, that's where I look, it kind of moving beyond the pill. Ultimately, that's where success needs to be at.
Keith, you've done a great job answering questions. Chris, do you have any more that you see there in the question box?
I think that was all of them.
That's it. Well, Keith, we can't thank you enough. You've done an excellent job, excellent presentation, terrific Q&A. But before we close, do you have any final comments you'd like to share with the attendees?
Yeah, so I do want to say, Steve, thank you very much for this opportunity. Is that, I've, like I said, I've enjoyed presenting here. And like I said, some of the perspectives that I have, I definitely welcome an open discussion around it because at the end of the day, to me, it's really about really trying to partner and trying to address any concerns because, when I work, like I said, with various clinicians, when I work with payers, what I was kind of thinking in the back of my mind is that the common ground is really, it's about trying to improve patient outcomes. And so, if there are additional questions, comments that come up, if people have questions, please don't hesitate to reach out to me. Like I said, if I can address them, fantastic. If I can't, hopefully I can point you in the right direction, to address them. And like I said, hopefully this will actually lead to some more awareness with regards to, pharma trying to move beyond the pill and really trying to be a trusted partner in working with clinicians and payers and the like, and administrators as well, of really trying to be more focused on the patient and the complexity that's associated with providing great care for them.
As you and I were talking prior to the beginning, if ultimately we improve the outcome for the patients, then we've contributed to the overall success of the treatment. Keith, we just can't thank you enough. What a great job. We've really enjoyed this. And this will conclude our webinar. But to our attendees, thank you so much. I think you saw where Chris put in the information box that you will be sent a link and you'll be sent this sometime tomorrow morning so that you'll have a copy. But this concludes our webinar, and thanks to everyone for your participation.
Thank you.